Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? My guests for this episode were Matt Pinkett and Mark Roberts, the authors of Boys Don't Try, Rethinking Masculinity in Schools. Matt is a head of English in a school in Surrey, and Mark is an assistant principal at a mixed 11 to 18 comprehensive school in Devon. They've been working and putting together these ideas on masculinity and why boys are underperforming in school for quite some time, and also dispelling some of the myths about how teachers should operate and work with boys as well. I took some time to talk to both Matt and Mark over Zoom. Unfortunately, there was a few technological problems, so apologies if the sound drops out or goes a little bit robotic at times. If you do need more information, however, you will be able to follow both Matt and Mark on Twitter. They will give their details at the end, and you can also download the Boys Don't Try podcast. So apologies for the bad sound on this one, but I hope you find something of interest. Hi, thanks a lot for taking the time to talk to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourselves, please?
Yeah, my name's Mark Roberts. I'm an assistant principal. I work in 11 to 18 mixed comprehensive in Devon.
And I'm Matt Pinkett, and I'm an assistant head of teaching, learning and assessment at an autistic school in Feltham.
Great. Cheers, guys. The reason I wanted to talk to you for the podcast was about your publication, Boys Don't Try, Rethinking Masculinity in Schools. How did it all start to begin with?
That's a good question. So I think initially we were both writing a lot about gender, about masculinity, about boys and why boys weren't doing as well as girls generally. And so I was like a bit of the boy expert as far as I was aware. And then I started reading this other guy who started knocking these blogs out. And I was like, what's he doing? Treading on my toes, encroaching on my territory. And annoyingly, they were really good as well. I don't know who he was. So anyway, Matt and I ended up joining together.
Didn't know who I was. He's been nice there. The blogs weren't... I was writing a lot about masculinity, but I was talking some proper bullshit as well at times.
Yeah, as was I.
We both were, weren't we? And that's kind of where that's where that subtitle, Rethinking Masculinity in Schools came from. It was like, we want other people to rethink it because we've had to do a lot of rethinking ourselves,
And we look back on some of those earlier blogs that we wrote at the time that we felt were really quite profound, and we wince now, don't we? We've come a long way in our thinking over a few years. So yeah, we just wanted to get together and wanted to write something. We got so many questions buzzing around in our head about what is it, what is contributing to this long-standing issue of male underachievement. So yeah, we thought we need to nail it down on paper, and that's what we did.
Great. And talking about achievement, I hate to start with results because that shouldn't be what all education's about, but we do know in terms of results, boys are lagging behind girls, have been at GCSE A level for at least 2 decades. From your research, what are the main reasons you found why that happens? I know you can't just pinpoint it down to one reason, but what are the main reasons why that's occurring?
I think that in some of the chapters that we look at in the book, there is a large overlapping whole series of reasons, but I think that if we were going to narrow it down into a few, obviously the issues around masculinity, which we're going to go into a bit more detail, are kind of hanging around in the background, but I think there's peer pressure is a big part of it. I think teachers' lower expectations of boys are part of it. And then also I think that the disastrous strategies that have been put into place over many years to try to engage boys which have backfired. And those are probably the main things that I'd want to pinpoint to begin with.
Great. Yeah, Matt, did you want to add anything to that as well?
I mean, for me, the biggest one for me has got to be expectations. I mean, Mark mentioned peer pressure, but those the pressure that you get from your peers, that is born out of expectations that I believe are perpetuated and prolonged and all the rest of it by adults, parents, the media, and teachers.
Yeah, it's the key word is expectations, because I talked about those engagement strategies, and those ultimately come out of low expectations as well. So yeah, Matt's right. That is the key theme that runs throughout all of it.
Yeah. Should we start with expectations then? Because is one of you a sociologist? Because there's quite a lot of sociology in the book that I noticed.
We both did
okay.
sociology.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did A-level sociology, but yeah, I didn't take it further than that.
Yeah, I did quite a bit of it at uni as well. So we're both English teachers with a very keen interest in sociology as well. But I've never taught it or anything like that.
Yeah, great. The reason I ask is you talk quite a lot about teacher labelling, self-fulfilling prophecies. Students will have heard of the Pygmalion effect that you mentioned in your books as well. Where's the main issues with labelling? Where does it start? Is it more problematic from the individual, the teacher?
Do you want to start with that, Mark?
So the question is, where does it start?
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of gender, it starts. It starts before they've even got to school.
Yeah.
I told the story before of my daughter started nursery. She was only 1.5, and she came home with pink fingernails.
Yeah.
It's drip fed in from everybody. What you get a lot of. Particularly with gender, is like these kind of pseudo-scientific sound bites that are published in these scientific journals or these sociological journals. And obviously, the stuff that gets published is the stuff that's juicy, and then it gets picked up by some mainstream newspaper. And then all of a sudden, there are male brains and female brains. Yeah. All of a sudden... men are promiscuous because they needed to be to propagate the population or whatever, and you get all these kind of these ridiculous ideas. But in answer to your question, where does it start? I think it starts from day one. Yeah, of course it starts from day one.
Yeah.
In fact, it starts even before that, doesn't it? At the baby shower.
Yes.
If you're having a girl, it's all pink balloons and pink cake and princess and unicorns. And if you're having a boy, they got a cake with a big bloody gun on the top of it.
Yeah. I think from a school perspective, Matt's absolutely right. But there's a really interesting study that we write about in the book, and we've talked about this quite a bit, by Lynn Barnett, that came out in 2018. It's called The Education of Playful Boys, Class Clowns in the Classroom, which is from the journal Frontiers in Psychology. And this one's a fascinating one that we both really were gripped by. And it tracks groups of boys and girls over pretty much their time in primary school, and shows how, despite similar behaviour, boys who are kind of quite boisterous and playful are judged as class clowns by their teachers, where girls who behave in this kind of playful way don't get attached with that label. They don't attract that label. And to begin with, it's not much of an issue. Everybody thinks that these kids are a bit fun, and these boys they laugh at them, and they're still popular, and they've got friends. But gradually, over time, they lose their self-esteem. They start to irritate their teachers, and gradually they really become quite disenchanted with schooling and become moved away from their friendship groups. And it's something that's really destructive. So that's just one example of some of the many studies that we looked at.
It's a heartbreaking study. That it's a long one. So they track the boys, all the boys and the girls actually at 5 years old, 7 years old, and then at 12, I believe. Being both boys and girls dick around on the playground, or make fart noises, or tell jokes during lessons. But it's only the boys that get labelled the class clown. And like Mark says, it's fine being a class clown at 5 years old. But fast forward 7 years, and those boys who were identified or labelled as class clowns are now, they've got no self-esteem. They know that they're unpopular. They know their teachers don't like them. They don't see themselves as able to learn, which is tragic, but it's rendered more tragic, I think, when you see that those very same girls who exhibited those kind of class clownish behaviours at 5 years old, fast forward 7 years, and they're the girls who weren't labelled are doing all right.
Yeah.
You know?
And talking about the expectations as well, expectations from the teachers. All three of us here are teachers. Surely we would not go into that knowingly. We wouldn't purposely go into a new academic year in September with lower expectations for boys and girls, or rather I'd hope we wouldn't. So how does that manifest itself?
I think teaching should be particularly are a particular area of concern when it comes to unconscious bias for two reasons. First reason is, and I think Julia Snell, she's an academic that originally posed this question, or this theory, is that actually because so much of what we do as teachers is involved with cohort groups, how are the EAL kids doing? How are the SEN kids doing? How are the Gypsy traveller children doing? So much of our daily discourse is based around categorising and labelling children, that actually we could be more prone, than other professions to kind of viewing kids stereotypically. And, we know that humans do stereotype, and the reason humans stereotype is to make sense of the world and to make, bring a little bit of order into all the chaos. And I don't think it's unfair to say that teachers are a pretty chaotic world. So actually these kind of little stereotypes can be quite useful for us, whether we know it or not. I'm not. But so that's the first thing. I think this preoccupation with cohort groups could make teachers particularly prone to stereotyping. But also, I think the danger is compounded by the fact that in teaching there's this kind of martyr complex. As you say, none of us go into it thinking we're going to prejudice against certain kids. We go into it because this is a noble profession, and unlike everybody else that didn't choose to become teachers, we are these kind of paragons of virtue who, we exemplify those kind of like saintly traits that we want to project onto the children we teach. And so, of course, we're not biased. And I think that might make some teachers less likely to confront their bias because they absolutely refuse to accept or to admit that actually they're not the saints that everybody expects them to be.
Yeah,
that comes out in the Mile and Jones study, the classic one that we refer to a lot from 2004, where they interview lots of teachers who say that they really do believe that boys can do just as well. And they really espouse this belief in this equality of potential. But when it gets down to the nitty-gritty of the real classroom and the real school scenarios where, as Matt says, it's chaotic, it's hectic, you've got 30 kids in front of you, you might not slept very well that night before, whatever it may be, you start to see the situation. There's a discrepancy between what the teachers thought that they believed, the theoretical views about boys' potential, with what comes out in reality. And in reality, they end up into these stereotypes that Matt's just so eloquently described.
Yeah.
Checking your bias requires effort. It requires and teachers are juggling so many plates, we're in the classroom and in our professions. So the idea that actually we're all the time finding adequate time and making adequate effort to negate any potential bias that we might have is ludicrous. Yeah. So I'm not, as Mark said, I'm not condemning teachers who are biased. I think it's natural, but I do think it's a problem.
Yeah, and I think unconscious is the key word, isn't it? Yeah.
But I will always say this again. This is this whole martyr complex that we have in this profession. There are teachers out there that are just not very nice people.
I'm sure, yeah.
Because, do you know what I mean? Because teachers are people, and that, I'm thinking about the mental health crisis in the profession at the moment. Is too often we refuse to admit that teachers are people.
Yeah.
That we position them as saints. So bias is unconscious, but there will be a few. There'll be a few teachers out there
I think there's probably an element probably an element of fear out there as well, actually, because to hold your hands up and admit you may treat boys and girls differently, or different races differently, or different classes differently, that takes a brave person or brave teacher to come out and admit that.
It does, yeah.
Yeah. Can we move on to the topic you said about peer pressure and masculinity in the classroom? What's your research found about why that is having such an impact on boys' performance?
Well, we know from quite a lot of research that boys tend to feel a greater pressure to conform to societal expectations about what it means to be a boy or what it means to be a man. So that's there in the background anyway. But one thing that I was particularly interested with, it was probably the most fascinating study that I looked at throughout the entire book. And this was a Belgian piece of research by Van Tighem and Van Houten, who they looked at this really large sample of about 6,000 year 8 pupils. So at this key point where they're kind of working their way through puberty and so on. And what they found is that both genders had this pressure to conform, this pressure to meet the expectations of what it meant to be a typical boy and a typical girl. But because the expectations of typical girls is that to be feminine is to be studious and diligent and hardworking and to hand your homework in on time and so on, even though there was this kind of pressure to conform, academically it came out in a real positive way for girls. It meant that they were pressurised into working hard. Whereas for boys, it's the exact opposite. And you get a large amount of boys who are influenced by peer pressure, who want to appear to be cool, who want to fit in with their group. Their expectation is that if you're going to be behaving in a way where you're kind of being studious and diligent and hardworking, you're basically behaving in a way that you're girlish. And this is something that really stands out, that boys are pressurised into not doing their work. Otherwise, they're going to be labelled as swats and they're going to be ostracised, or they're not going to be called gay or so on. So that's how it works. And this is something that's happening, I think, in lessons in the schools across the country for many, many boys.
Is that changing at all, Mark? Because there's studies from 50 years ago that said exactly the same thing. You would have thought this whole idea of feminisation of education or calling someone gay because they've read a book, you would have thought that we've got to the end of that, no?
Yeah, well, these traditional forms of masculinity are hanging in there, and what's interesting is people often think that this is a working class phenomenon. You look at people like Paul Willis's classic Learning to Labour study, and some people might say, well, that's just working class lads who fall into this trap. But actually, there's other studies. There's a really good Australian study by Wayne Martino that said that actually this is a middle class phenomenon as well, that you've got kids in affluent areas, boys who are wanting to appear cool, and they're having to hide the fact that they're doing work in private, that they're doing their homework on the slide, that they're kind of having to get decent grades without having to appear to try. So I don't think it's going away. I think that this is something that hangs around. And if you look at our current Prime Minister, what did he call David Cameron? Because David Cameron got a first. He was a girly swat. Yeah. This is something that I think goes throughout our entire society, and it's not going to go anywhere soon unless we do something about it.
And you also introduced terms of tender masculinity and non-tender masculinity. Would you mind just explaining what those terms mean? Because they might be new to some people.
Yeah, do you want to explain that one, Matt?
So, tender masculinity and non-tender masculinity. Non-tender masculinity is a term that we use for what everybody else calls toxic masculinity. So, non-tender masculinity is kind of all that like macho posturing, aggression, sexual deviance, sexual aggression, homophobia, all that kind of piss taking and stuff that boys indulge in. We decided against toxic masculinity because we felt that that word toxic, firstly, it suggested that I think that simply by virtue of being a man, there was something wrong with you, or certainly a man that presents himself in a masculine way. And also that word toxic, it suggests that masculinity is a kind of inevitable contagion that you can't protect yourself from. So we went for non-tender. The good thing about non-tender masculinity is just in the name itself, it points to the kind of more desirable alternative of tender masculinity, which I'll explain in a minute. I mean, do you know what? Since we've written this book, I did a talk recently where somebody questioned our use of the term non-tender masculinity, and she said that actually toxic masculinity, for all its problems, is still a preferable term. She gives the example of a man in a nightclub who gropes a woman who walks past him. What's a better thing to say to him? Sorry, sir, that's very non-tender of you. Or, sorry, sir, that's very toxic of you.
Yeah.
I still think that's something I'm a little bit unsure of. But anyway, I think what's really interesting is tender masculinity. So tender masculinity is a term coined by a blogger in America called Terra, Terra, Loire, Loire. And she was writing a blog about masculinity in film, and she just said that there's this new kind of tender masculinity emerging, where men are vulnerable when they need to be. They talk about their emotions. They protect women. They're accepting of all people, regardless of sexuality, colour, creed, and I just thought it was it's just a really beautiful term, I think. And certainly in the book, that's something we strongly advocate. We want teachers who read our book to come away thinking, do you know what, that's what we need for our boys. We need to imbue them with this tender masculinity, this masculinity that allows them to be open about their feelings and to stand up for what's right and to work hard and see the value of working hard and not be ashamed of it.
And to recognise also that the alternative, which just seems to be this natural state, it seems to be this is what you have to do to be a boy or to be a man, to recognise that there's something inherently destructive about embracing the non-tender side of it. There's something self-destructive about following that path.
Yeah. What do you say to people? I'm a sociologist, not so I would go against this theory. But the biological approach, a lot of people just say, well, that's just boys being boys. Boys and girls are different. They have different behaviours. Where do you stand with the biological approach?
I think that we hit it quite early on that we're not in favour of that. I mean, of course there are some innate biological differences, but they are pretty tiny in comparison to the massive differences when it comes to socialisation. When you see the kind of things that Matt's talked earlier about the way that boys get bought books and girls get bought books and boys get bought footballs for birthdays and all those kinds of things. And there's some really interesting studies that look at the way that we as adults push children into these so-called innate, so-called instinctive responses. The No More Boys and Girls documentary was a really good example of that. When it looked at the childcare, the way that they behaved, the childcare workers, depending on whether they thought it was a boy or a girl, and nudging them towards certain toys and things like that. That's just one example of we're strong believers in that it's more nurture than nature.
Yeah. I mean, the metaphor we use in the book is, a tiny pebble dropping into a lake. That tiny pebble is, it's insignificant, really. You wouldn't notice it if you were, you were walking on a beach or whatever. But that tiny pebble is these kind of negligible biological differences that actually, if we worked hard at, when there are biological differences, neuroplasticity and the way that the brain is malleable, actually we could rectify the problems there anyway. But anyway, these, the stone falling in the lake are these biological differences, and then these ripples, the increase in size as a result of that tiny difference. That's all the, the media sensationalism, these kind of, the way they turn these kind of, like I say, negligible biological differences into these kind of huge pseudo-scientific sensationalist monsters, really.
Yeah. And that leads us nicely onto actually the myths about how teachers think you should teach boys in comparison to girls. And that's kind of the starting point of the book, actually, isn't it?
Well, I didn't have time to put all of them in there,
Yeah.
so I just decided to focus on the three main ones that we see time and time again. And if people don't believe that these are myths, they should come and listen to Matt and I do talks, because whenever we ask teachers, and this is teachers of all subjects across all age ranges, can you write down for us what kind of strategies you've been told to use to engage boys? They always list these ones. You can just do like bingo and fall out it every single time. The first one is competition, the idea that you must use competition to get boys hooked into learning. The second one is that you need to try to make things relevant to boys' lives and their interests for them to want to be engaged in learning. And the third one, this monster that will not go away, is the idea of learning styles, and that boys need to be active in their learning and that they are kinesthetic learners.
And you, am I right in saying your research actually found that there's no difference kinesthetic learning? If anything, girls can be slightly more kinesthetic. Is that right?
Yeah, that's Younger et al, and that goes back to 2005. So I don't know when you trained, Matthew, but if I trained not long after that, and it was very much the done thing at the time, and it's still hanging on in there. So this is something that's still believed, despite the fact that as far back as 15 years ago, people were pointing out that this is just garbage, really, and that even if there was such a thing as learning styles, trying to adapt your lessons to fit this so-called particular preference.
Okay, so once you've expelled the myths of how we shouldn't be doing it, what's your research telling us in terms of how we should teach boys to try and get them more engaged?
Okay, so Professor Rob Coe, he's done a lot of work into what makes an effective teacher, and essentially we need to be doing for the boys what we're doing for the girls. In the book, Mark says no shortcuts, no gimmicks, and Rob Coe has shown that the best teachers are those that challenge their kids and have a high level of subject knowledge. I think that in the past, too often, what has occurred is that it's assumed that to be an expert, you just have to have a degree. Okay, so you do your degree in whatever subject it is, you become a teacher. That's your lot. And if that's not assumed, and school leaders are expecting you to develop your subject knowledge, then it's just kind of assumed that it's something you develop in your own time. And I don't think that's fair, really. I think that subject knowledge and teachers being subject experts is the most important thing in raising attainment.
Yeah.
And so I think that significant time should be dedicated to it in the school day. Teachers, I know we're in a time of austerity, but still lots of teachers get free time in the school day, particularly in secondary. And I think that too many teachers still feel guilty about using that free time to develop their subject knowledge, because instead they feel that they have to be putting data into systems, or observing people, or getting feedback, and all the rest of it. When actually, I think that school leaders and department leaders really need to be encouraging staff to actually just develop their subject knowledge between the hours of 8 and 3 o'clock in the school day. If you've got a free period, I'm totally happy with you watching a TED talk about Andy Warhol because you're delivering an art lesson on pop art next week. Or I'm totally happy if you want to put your feet up in your classroom for 50 minutes, read an autobiography of Charles Dickens because you're teaching year 10 the context around Great Expectations next month. And I don't think that happens enough. So I think that the development of subject knowledge is really important.
For me, modelling and explanations is an absolutely key part of making sure that you've got this high challenge for boys, but you're doing it in a way which is interesting, and the interest comes from the subject. It doesn't come from any games or any kind of gimmicks or any kind of competition. What you're doing is saying, I'm an expert in this subject, and I'm going to show you what really interesting, successful stuff looks like. And I know that this is aimed at people who are interested in sociology, and I've seen certain sociology lessons where the teacher has really modelled what a fantastic explanation, what a paragraph looks like, where you really explore one of these particular interesting approaches. For me, it just really brings it alive, and kids see it and boys see it, and they say, okay, I can do this now, because that's something that I think sets it apart rather than trying to do any kind of gimmicky stuff.
Yeah. And from your research, is the gap closing at all, or are you predicting a closing of the gap between boys and girls?
If you look at maths and physics, which are seen as the kind of the strongholds, it was only 1% difference within GCSE results last year between boys and girls, and in all of the subjects, girls are now in front, including some of the traditional STEM subjects. So the statistics are pretty bleak, actually.
Thank you. We're having a few technological problems, so I wanted to just finally ask for you to just outline where people can find out more about the book, and I know you've got a podcast running at the moment as well, so I wonder if you could just give some details on that.
Yeah, so I'm Positive Teacher, and Mark is Mr._English Teach. So you can follow us both on Twitter. I'm a nightmare with promoting this book. I mean, you'll get sick of me. But we've also just this week released the first episode of our own podcast. So if you go to Twitter @BoysDon'tTryPod, you can find the podcast there. And basically each episode of the podcast corresponds to a chapter from the book. So already there's a podcast episode all about boys' engagement. And next month there'll be one coming on disadvantaged boys and that. So check it out.
Yeah, if you want to find the book, it's published by Routledge, so you can either get it on their website or it's available on Amazon. And it's been really popular, been really successful. So we'd encourage you to check it out. I think we've had quite a few messages actually from sociology teachers saying that they've been recommending it to their A-level students and they've been using it in their essays, which has been really exciting, given that both of us several years ago were sat in the same place, and it's bizarre to think that someone might be citing our writing as they go into their A-level essay or A-level exam. So it's quality. Really enjoyable to hear that.
Great. And I'm really sorry for any technological problems, and I really appreciate both of you giving up your time this evening.
Pleasure. Thanks very much.
Cheers. Thanks, guys.
Love.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.